High above the mortal world, where moonlight drifts across marble and the wind carries whispers of ancient power, Olympus lies in quiet slumber. Tonight, you are invited to step into this sacred stillness, to walk among timeless gods and feel the gentle peace that even immortals know. The climb through the twilight clouds. As dusk settled over the ancient landscape of Greece, soft violet light draped itself across the slopes of Mount Olympus like a silk veil drawn over the world. The sun had descended beyond the western horizon, leaving behind streaks of amber and rose that painted the evening sky in colors that seemed to exist nowhere else, colors that belonged only to this liminal time between day and night, when the world held its breath and prepared for transformation. A lone wanderer named Lysander stood at the mountain's base, his eyes lifted toward the summit that disappeared into layers of clouds and gathering darkness. He was a man in his early 30s, his face weathered by travel and marked by the kind of weariness that comes not from physical exhaustion but from carrying too much for too long, too many responsibilities, too many concerns, too many thoughts that circled endlessly without resolution. He had come to this sacred mountain for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, even to himself. Perhaps it was the stories his mother had told him as a child, tales of gods who dwelt above the clouds, who shaped the world with their will and watched over mortals with varying degrees of interest and compassion. Perhaps it was simply the need to escape, to find somewhere so removed from ordinary life that even his troubles couldn't follow. Or perhaps, most truthfully, it was the desperate hope that somewhere, anywhere, peace might still exist, that the constant noise in his mind might finally quiet if he climbed high enough, far enough, into a realm that existed beyond the reach of everyday concerns. The path that led up the mountain was ancient, worn smooth by countless feet over countless centuries. Pilgrims had walked this way for generations, seeking the gods, seeking answers, seeking miracles, or simply seeking to stand in a place that was holy, that connected earth and sky, mortal and divine. The path was narrow in places, barely wide enough for a single person, and it wound back and forth across the mountain's face, ascending gradually, patiently, as though the mountain itself was teaching those who climbed it about the virtue of steady, unhurried progress. Lysander began to climb as the last light faded from the sky. Cool mist began to gather around his ankles, rising from the earth as though the mountain was breathing out, releasing the day's warmth into the evening air. The mist was gentle, almost tender in its touch, curling around him like silk, like water, like something alive and aware of his presence. With each step upward, the sounds of the world below began to fade. The distant bleating of goats being herded home for the night, the far-off voices of villagers calling to one another as they prepared their evening meals, the barking of dogs and the creaking of cartwheels on rough roads, all of it diminished gradually until it was gone completely, replaced by a quiet so profound that Lysander became aware of sounds he usually never noticed. His own breathing, steady and rhythmic. His footsteps on stone, soft and measured. The whisper of wind through sparse vegetation clinging to rocky slopes. The distant call of a night bird somewhere above, its cry echoing off cliff faces before fading into silence. The quiet was not empty or void. It had texture, presence, weight. It pressed gently against him, not threatening or oppressive but inviting, welcoming, as though the mountain was creating space for him, clearing away the noise that usually filled the world and offering him the gift of stillness. As he climbed higher, the mist thickened, rising to his knees, then his waist, until he was walking through clouds that had descended to meet him or perhaps that he had ascended to meet. The moisture beaded on his skin, cool and refreshing, and each breath of the mist-laden air felt cleansing, as though he was breathing in something purer than ordinary atmosphere, something that carried the essence of high places, of realm between earth and sky. The light changed as he climbed. The darkness that had settled over the lower slopes gave way to a strange twilight that seemed to have no source, as though the very air itself was luminous. The clouds around him began to glow faintly, suffused with colors that shifted and changed, now violet, now silver, now the palest gold, now a blue so soft it was almost white. Lysander paused to catch his breath and looked back the way he had come. Below him, the world was lost in darkness and cloud. He could see nothing of the valley, nothing of the villages and fields and olive groves that spread across the landscape. It was as though he had climbed out of the ordinary world entirely, had left behind everything familiar and entered a realm that existed in isolation, separate, sovereign, belonging only to itself. The realization brought not fear but a strange sense of relief. Up here, his problems seemed smaller, less urgent, less capable of demanding his constant attention. The work that awaited him, the decisions he needed to make, the relationships that required tending, the endless list of obligations and responsibilities, all of it felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else's life, to a person he had been but was no longer, at least for this moment, at least while he stood on this mountain wrapped in glowing clouds. He turned and continued climbing, and with each step, something inside him began to shift. The tension he had been carrying in his shoulders for months, perhaps years, started to ease. The churning in his mind, the constant stream of thoughts and worries and plans, began to quiet, not through effort or will but simply because the atmosphere of this place didn't support that kind of noise, couldn't sustain that level of internal chaos. The path grew steeper, but Lysander found he didn't mind. His legs were strong, his breathing steady, and the physical exertion felt good, felt cleansing, as though he was working something out of his body with each step, purging accumulated stress and anxiety through simple movement and effort. Above him, beyond the clouds he was climbing through, he could see other clouds, massive formations that rose like mountains themselves, their peaks illuminated by some light he couldn't identify. They glowed with a soft golden radiance that was not quite sunlight, not quite moonlight, but something else, something that seemed to come from within the clouds themselves or perhaps from beyond them, from whatever lay at the mountain's summit. The light was beautiful, mesmerizing, and Lysander found himself climbing toward it without conscious decision, drawn by something he couldn't name, pulled by a force that was gentle but irresistible, as though the mountain itself wanted him to reach the top, as though something waited there that he needed to encounter, even if he didn't yet know what it was. The wind, which had been still at the mountain's base, began to move around him, but it was not the harsh, cold wind he had expected at high altitude. Instead, it was warm and gentle, almost caressing, brushing against his face and hands with a touch that felt intentional, aware, as though the wind itself was conscious and welcoming him, acknowledging his presence and guiding him upward. Even the wind seemed to walk softly beside him, Lysander thought, and the phrase felt right, felt true. Everything about this place moved with gentleness, with patience, with the kind of reverence that comes from being in the presence of something sacred. Time became strange as he climbed. He couldn't tell if he had been walking for minutes or hours. The twilight remained constant, neither brightening nor darkening, creating a sense of existing outside normal temporal flow, in a pocket where duration didn't matter, where there was only the eternal present of this moment, this breath, this step. And then, gradually, the clouds began to thin. Lysander could see stars appearing above him, first a few scattered points of light, then more, then so many that the sky seemed crowded with them, as though all the stars in the universe had gathered to witness his ascent, or perhaps simply to exist in this place where the boundary between earth and heaven grew thin. The path leveled out slightly, and Lysander sensed he was nearing the summit. The air around him felt different, not thinner, as it should have been at this altitude, but somehow richer, more present, charged with a quality he couldn't name but that made every breath feel significant, every moment feel weighted with potential. Above him, the golden glow intensified, no longer coming from distant clouds but from something closer, something just ahead, something that existed beyond the final turn in the path, beyond the last veil of mist that separated him from whatever lay at the mountain's peak. Lysander took a deep breath, touched his hand to his chest, feeling his heart beating steadily, strongly, and took the final steps that would carry him to the summit of Olympus, to the realm of the gods, to whatever waited for him in that place of golden light and profound stillness, ready to receive whatever gift or lesson or simply moment of peace this sacred mountain might offer to a weary traveler who had climbed seeking something he couldn't name but desperately needed to find. The gates of the eternal summit. The path turned one final time, winding around a massive outcropping of stone that jutted from the mountain's face like the prow of a ship cutting through seas of cloud. And as Lysander rounded that corner, the mist parted suddenly, dramatically, like curtains being drawn aside to reveal a stage, and he found himself standing at the entrance to something that could not possibly exist yet undeniably did. Before him stretched a high plateau, vast and impossibly level, as though the mountain's peak had been smoothed by divine hands into a perfect platform suspended between earth and sky. The surface beneath his feet changed from rough mountain stone to something smoother, more refined, not quite marble but similar, a pale stone that seemed to glow faintly from within, as though lit by stars embedded in its substance. And at the far end of this plateau, perhaps 100 paces distant, stood two enormous pillars. They rose from the stone platform like the legs of titans, so tall that their tops disappeared into the luminous clouds above. Each pillar was perfectly cylindrical, carved from marble so white it seemed to contain all colors at once, reflecting the strange twilight in hues that shifted as Lysander watched, now silver, now gold, now the palest blue, now pearl white touched with rose. The pillars were not crude or rough but smooth as glass, their surfaces polished to impossible perfection. And carved into them, running from base to heights beyond sight, were patterns that might have been decoration or might have been some form of writing in a language older than human speech. The patterns seemed to move as he looked at them, shifting and flowing like water or smoke, never quite resolving into something he could fully comprehend but always suggesting meaning just beyond his grasp. But what truly captured his attention, what made him stop and stare with a mixture of awe and disbelief, were the threads of light that wrapped around the pillars like vines around ancient trees. They were not solid or substantial but seemed to be made of pure starlight, luminous strands that spiraled up and around the marble, pulsing gently, rhythmically, as though breathing or perhaps marking time in increments far slower than mortal heartbeats. The threads created patterns of shadow and light on the pillars' surfaces, and those patterns seemed intentional, purposeful, as though they were telling a story or mapping the heavens or perhaps doing both simultaneously. Lysander could trace individual threads with his eyes, could follow their spiraling paths upward until they vanished into the clouds, could see how they interwove and separated, creating designs of such complexity and beauty that they seemed to exist beyond human aesthetic understanding. Between the two pillars, the space was open, forming a gateway that led somewhere. Beyond it, Lysander could see light, the golden radiance he had been climbing toward, but he couldn't make out details, couldn't see what existed beyond this threshold. It was as though the gateway marked a boundary, a transition point between one realm and another, and what lay beyond was veiled not by physical obstruction but by the simple fact that mortal eyes were not quite meant to see it until the proper moment arrived. Lysander approached the pillars slowly, reverently, his footsteps making no sound on the glowing stone. As he drew closer, he became aware of something else, a sensation beneath his feet, a gentle vibration that was not quite physical, not quite audible, but that he could feel resonating through his body like the echo of some vast, deep sound, like the humming of the earth itself, or perhaps the music of the spheres that ancient philosophers claimed filled the cosmos but which mortal ears could not detect. The hum was not unpleasant. If anything, it was soothing, reassuring, like the purring of some enormous cat or the distant singing of whales in ocean depths. It spoke of age, of permanence, of forces so vast and ancient that human concerns were like ripples on the surface of a bottomless ocean, real but temporary, significant but fleeting, deserving of compassion but ultimately transitory. The air between the pillars thickened as Lysander approached, not with fear, as he might have expected, but with something else, something he could only describe as sacred stillness. It was the quality of atmosphere in temples and holy places, the weight of reverence and long devotion, the accumulated presence of countless pilgrims who had stood in these spaces seeking connection with something greater than themselves. But this was more intense than any temple Lysander had visited. This was not a place built by humans to honor the divine. This was a threshold to the realm of divinity itself, a boundary between the mortal world and the dwelling place of the gods, and the air itself seemed to recognize the significance of that distinction, seemed to hold its breath in acknowledgement of the transition he was about to make. Lysander paused before the gateway, one hand reaching out to touch the nearest pillar. His fingers contacted cool marble, smooth as silk, and the moment he made contact, he felt a surge of something. Not quite energy, not quite emotion, but a communication of sorts, wordless and direct. The pillar was aware of him, he realized. Not conscious in the way humans were conscious, but aware nonetheless, observing his presence, assessing his intentions, perhaps judging his worthiness to pass through the gateway it guarded. But there was no hostility in that assessment, no threat or challenge. Only a gentle examination, as though the pillar, or whatever consciousness resided within or around it, was simply curious about who he was, what he sought, whether he came with reverence or arrogance, with humility or entitlement. Lysander kept his hand on the marble and closed his eyes, allowing himself to be observed, to be known, offering no resistance or concealment. He had come seeking peace, seeking rest from the constant noise of his internal world, and if that made him worthy to enter, then he would be allowed through. If not, then he would turn back, would descend the mountain, would return to his ordinary life carrying at least the memory of having stood at this threshold, having glimpsed something beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. The humming beneath his feet intensified slightly, grew warmer, and Lysander felt rather than heard a response, not words but a meaning that translated in his mind as, "You may enter. You are welcomed. Come and find what you seek." He opened his eyes and removed his hand from the pillar. The gateway before him seemed somehow more accessible now, less imposing, as though permission granted had altered the nature of the threshold itself, had transformed it from barrier to invitation. Taking a deep breath, Lysander stepped forward, passing between the two massive pillars, crossing from one realm into another, moving from the world he knew into something that existed beyond the maps of ordinary reality. The transition was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no sense of being transported or transformed. He simply walked forward, one step and then another, moving through the space between the pillars, and as he did, the world changed around him. The clouds and mist that had been present everywhere on his climb suddenly cleared, not gradually but instantly, as though he had stepped through a veil or crossed an invisible boundary that marked the edge of one atmospheric system and the beginning of another. The sky above him, which had been twilit and star-scattered, now opened into a vast dome of perfect clarity, luminous with a light that came from everywhere and nowhere, illuminating without creating harsh shadows or bright spots. The summit of Olympus stretched before him, and it was nothing like he had imagined. He had expected, perhaps, ruins, the crumbled remains of ancient temples, testament to a time when people believed the gods dwelt here in physical form. Or he had expected emptiness, just another mountain peak, remarkable for its height but ultimately ordinary, devoid of divine presence, proving that the old stories were merely myths, that the gods had never existed except in human imagination. But what lay before him was neither ruins nor emptiness. It was a realm unto itself, a place that existed in defiance of ordinary logic, that occupied space but seemed to exist partially outside space, that was present yet somehow also eternal, fixed yet fluid, real beyond question yet dreamlike in its impossibility. The plateau extended farther than Lysander could see, stretching into distances that seemed to curve upward at the edges, as though he stood at the center of a vast bowl. The ground was covered in the same luminous stone he had first encountered, but here it was interspersed with gardens and groves, with structures that were part architecture and part natural formation, with features that seemed to shift depending on how he looked at them, now appearing as columns and courtyards, now as trees and clearings, now as something in between, as though the realm couldn't quite decide whether to be palace or paradise and had chosen to be both simultaneously. The sky above was silver, not gray or white but true silver, as though the heavens themselves were made of polished metal reflecting some light source beyond sight. And across that silver expanse, stars drifted in slow circles, moving with visible motion, close enough that Lysander felt he could reach up and touch them, could pluck them from the sky like fruit from low-hanging branches. The air was warm, but not hot, the perfect temperature of early summer, of lazy afternoons and gentle evenings, of the moment when the day's heat has faded but night's chill has not yet arrived. A breeze moved through this realm, constant but gentle, carrying scents that Lysander couldn't quite identify but that reminded him of flowers and sunlight, of honey and rain, of every pleasant smell he had ever encountered distilled and combined into a single, perfect fragrance. And the quality of the place, the fundamental atmosphere that pervaded everything, was stillness. Not silence, for there were sounds. The gentle whisper of the breeze, the distant tinkling of water, soft musical notes that might have been wind chimes or might have been something else entirely. But beneath and around and through all these sounds was a profound stillness, a peace so deep and complete that it seemed to exist as a physical presence, as tangible as the stone beneath his feet or the air filling his lungs. This was not the mountain of storms he had heard of in stories, not the place where Zeus hurled lightning and shook the earth with his thunder. This was something else entirely, a place of quiet eternity, of timeless peace, of rest that was not sleep but simply perfect repose. Lysander stood just beyond the gateway, his legs trembling slightly, not from the climb but from the overwhelming sense of having crossed into something sacred, something that should not exist but did, something that rendered his previous understanding of reality incomplete at best and perhaps entirely mistaken. He was on Olympus. The true Olympus, not the mountain that appeared on maps but the realm that existed adjacent to it, overlapping with it but separate, accessible only to those who climbed with the right intentions and found the gateway open to receive them. And somewhere in this vast, peaceful realm, the gods dwelt still, not as myths or memories but as living presences, as consciousness vast and ancient, as forces that shaped reality not through violence or domination but through their simple existence, their eternal being. Lysander took another step forward, then another, moving deeper into this impossible place, ready to discover what waited for a mortal who had been granted entrance to the dwelling place of the divine, prepared to receive whatever gift or lesson this realm of stillness might offer to one who had climbed seeking peace and found instead something far greater, a glimpse of eternity itself. The Hearth of Hestia. Lysander walked slowly through the realm of Olympus, his senses overwhelmed by beauty and strangeness in equal measure. The landscape around him seemed to shift and flow in ways that defied physical laws, pathways that appeared straight from one angle curved when viewed from another, distances that seemed vast compressed into a few steps, while spaces that looked intimate revealed unexpected depths when approached. But despite the disorienting nature of the geography, he never felt lost or confused. Something guided him, not a voice or visible presence, but an intuition, a sense of being gently directed toward where he needed to go, as though the realm itself was conscious of his presence and was leading him along a specific path designed for his particular needs. As he walked, a soft glow caught his attention, emanating from somewhere ahead and to his right. Unlike the ambient luminescence that suffused everything on Olympus, this light had a warmer quality, a golden-orange hue that reminded him of sunset or candlelight, of hearth fires on winter evenings, of every warm and welcoming light he had ever encountered. He followed the glow, drawn by something more than curiosity, by a sense of longing, perhaps, or recognition, as though part of him already knew what he would find and was eager to arrive there, to be in the presence of whatever created that particular quality of light. The path led him to a small circular courtyard, intimate in scale compared to the vast spaces he had crossed. The courtyard was enclosed by a low wall of the same luminous stone that covered much of Olympus, and within that enclosure grew flowers that seemed to exist in perpetual bloom, their petals glowing softly in shades of cream and gold and the palest rose. But what dominated the courtyard, what drew his eye immediately and held it completely, was the flame at its center. It burned in a shallow bowl carved from stone, raised on a simple pedestal perhaps waist-high. The flame was not large, barely a foot tall, but it possessed a presence far beyond its physical size. It burned steadily, without flickering or wavering, its light warm and golden, casting gentle illumination across the courtyard and creating an atmosphere of such profound comfort, such immediate sense of home and safety, that Lysander felt his eyes begin to sting with unexpected emotion. And beside the flame, seated on a simple stone bench, was a woman. She was neither young nor old, or perhaps she was both simultaneously, her face unlined yet carrying the depth that comes only with great age, her posture upright and strong yet radiating the ease that comes from complete rest. She wore a simple white peplos, unadorned except for a bronze clasp at one shoulder, and her dark hair was bound in a plain braid that fell over one shoulder. Her presence radiated something Lysander could only describe as comfort, not commanding or mighty, not awe-inspiring or terrible, but deeply, profoundly familiar, like returning to a home you never realized you missed, Like being welcomed by someone who had always been waiting for you, who had prepared a place for you, who knew you were coming even before you knew yourself. This was Hestia, goddess of the hearth, keeper of the sacred flame, the quiet center around which all else revolved. She looked up as Lysander entered the courtyard, and her eyes, warm brown, steady, infinitely gentle, met his with such immediate understanding, such complete absence of judgment or demand, that he felt something break open inside him. Some sealed place that had been protecting itself for too long, some defended territory of the heart that suddenly, in her presence, no longer needed defending. "Traveler," she said softly, her voice like the crackling of comfortable fires, like the quiet sound of bread rising, like every domestic comfort translated into speech. "Few come to Olympus seeking rest rather than answers." She gestured to the bench beside her, indicating he should sit, and Lysander found himself moving forward without conscious decision, drawn by the invitation, by the flame's warmth, by the simple human, or perhaps divine, gesture of welcome that required no words beyond the opening of space, the offering of a place to rest. He sat, and immediately felt the rightness of being here, in this courtyard, beside this fire, next to this quiet goddess who asked nothing of him, who simply made space for his presence and allowed him to be exactly as he was, tired, confused, carrying burdens he couldn't name, seeking peace he didn't know how to find. The flame crackled gently before them, and Lysander realized it gave off no heat, or rather, it gave off warmth but not the physical heat that burns or causes discomfort. This was a different kind of warmth, one that touched not the skin but something deeper, that radiated into the core of his being and loosened knots he hadn't known existed, that melted frozen places and allowed what had been rigid to become fluid again. He watched the flame, mesmerized by its steady burning, by the way it moved without flickering, by how it seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with his own breathing, or perhaps his breathing was synchronizing with it, matching its eternal rhythm, becoming part of the pattern it maintained. Hestia sat quietly beside him, not speaking, not demanding conversation or explanation. Her presence was simply there, solid, reliable, infinitely patient. She was waiting, he understood, for him to be ready, to find the words or simply the internal state that would allow what needed to happen to unfold naturally. Time passed, how much, Lysander couldn't say. The silver sky above remained constant, the stars continuing their slow drift, the warm breeze still carrying its perfect scents. On Olympus, time seemed to exist differently, or perhaps not at all, flowing according to needs rather than fixed increments, expanding to accommodate what was necessary, contracting when urgency arose, but mostly just existing as an eternal present where past and future were less important than this moment, this breath, this experience. Finally, Hestia spoke again, her voice gentle, inquiring without demanding. "You carry too many unspoken burdens." It was not a question but a simple statement of observation, said without judgment or criticism, merely acknowledging what she saw, what her divine perception revealed about the mortal sitting beside her hearth. Lysander felt his throat tighten. The words struck something true, something he had been avoiding or denying or simply not allowing himself to fully acknowledge. Yes, he carried burdens. So many burdens. Worries about his future, regrets about his past, anxieties about the present. Responsibilities he wasn't sure he could fulfill. Expectations, his own and others, that felt impossible to meet. Grief for losses he had never properly mourned. Fear of failures he hadn't yet experienced but could imagine with vivid clarity. All of it was there, always there, weighing on him, filling his mind, occupying space that should have been available for rest, for peace, for simply experiencing life without the constant pressure of worry and concern. "Let the flame hold them for a while," Hestia murmured, her hand gesturing toward the fire burning steadily before them. The suggestion seemed strange, impossible. How could a flame hold burdens? How could fire take weight that existed in thoughts and emotions rather than physical form? But even as the rational part of his mind raised these objections, another part, deeper, more intuitive, understood what she meant and understood that it was not metaphor but literal instruction, that on Olympus, in the presence of a goddess, such things were not only possible but natural, that the boundaries between physical and psychological, between matter and mind, were more permeable than mortal experience typically allowed. Lysander looked at the flame, really looked at it, and as he did, he began to see it differently. Not as combustion of fuel and oxygen, but as something living, conscious, aware. The flame was presence, was attention, was the goddess's own essence made visible and accessible, and it was offering to do exactly what Hestia had said, to hold his burdens, not to solve them or make them disappear, but simply to carry them for a while, to give him respite, to allow his internal landscape to relax and rest. He thought about his worries, not all of them, that would take too long, but the ones that pressed most heavily. His fear that he was wasting his life, that the choices he had made were wrong, that he had somehow missed the path he was supposed to walk and was now lost in territory that would never lead anywhere meaningful. And as he held that fear in his mind, looking at the flame, something remarkable happened. The burden began to lift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually, steadily, like setting down a heavy pack he had been carrying for miles. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders, the tightness in his chest, the constant low-level anxiety that accompanied that particular fear, all of it began to ease. The flame seemed to brighten slightly, or perhaps it was his perception that brightened, but he had the distinct sense that the fire had received what he offered, had taken the burden and was now holding it, keeping it safe but separate from him, giving him space to exist without its constant pressure. Encouraged, Lysander offered another burden, his regret about relationships that had ended badly, words said in anger that could never be unsaid, choices made that hurt people he cared about. And again, the flame accepted it, took it, held it, and he felt the weight of that regret diminish, not disappearing but becoming manageable, no longer dominating his internal landscape. One by one, he offered his burdens to the flame, his grief, his anxiety, his shame, his fear, all the accumulated weight of living that had become too heavy to carry alone. And one by one, the flame accepted them, held them, freed him from their constant pressure. He watched as the flame burned, still steady, still eternal, apparently unchanged by what it now held. But Lysander felt profoundly changed. His breath came easier. His shoulders relaxed from positions they had held for so long he had forgotten they were tense. His mind, which had been churning constantly with worry and concern, grew quiet, spacious, able to simply be rather than constantly problem-solving and anxiety-managing. Beside him, Hestia smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that suggested she had witnessed this transformation countless times over countless ages, that mortals had been coming to her hearth since the beginning, offering their burdens, finding respite in the simple act of being present with sacred flame and allowing what was too heavy to be carried for a while by something that could bear infinite weight without strain. "The burdens will return," she said softly, truthfully. "When you leave this place, when you descend the mountain and return to your life, they will be there waiting. The flame cannot make them disappear forever. Lysander nodded, understanding, but to his surprise, the knowledge didn't distress him. Because he also understood something else now, something the flame and the goddess had taught him through direct experience rather than words. The burdens were not permanent fixtures, were not fundamental aspects of his being. They were things he carried, yes, but things he could also, at least temporarily, set down. They were part of his experience but not the totality of it. Beneath them, surrounding them, existing always even when they pressed most heavily, was something else, a core of peace, a fundamental okayness, a self that existed independent of the problems and worries and fears that occupied so much of his attention. He had forgotten that self, had lost touch with it, had allowed the burdens to become so familiar and constant that he had mistaken them for his essential nature. But they were not. They were temporary, changeable, ultimately less real than the peace that dwelt beneath them. "Thank you," Lysander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for this gift." Hestia inclined her head in acknowledgement. "The gift is not mine alone," she said. "The flame has always been there, in one form or another, for those who seek it. In every hearth fire, in every candle lit with intention, in every moment of warmth and safety and home. I am simply its keeper, its manifestation in this realm. But the peace it offers, the rest it provides, that is available always, to all who remember to seek it." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flame burn eternal, and Lysander felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember, simple contentment, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do, which in this case was nothing more than sitting beside a sacred fire and allowing himself to rest. The Garden of Silent Stars. After a time that might have been minutes or hours, time continuing its strange, flexible behavior on Olympus, Hestia rose from the bench with graceful fluidity. The movement was not abrupt or dismissive but simply natural, as though some internal rhythm had indicated it was time for the next phase, time for Lysander to continue his journey through this realm of gods and discover what else awaited him. "Come," she said gently, extending her hand toward a path that led from the courtyard, a path Lysander was certain hadn't been visible when he first arrived. "There is someone else who wishes to meet you, something else you need to see." Lysander stood, feeling lighter than he had in months, perhaps years. The weight he had been carrying had not disappeared, he understood that, but it had been acknowledged, witnessed, temporarily lifted, and that simple act had transformed something fundamental in how he experienced himself and his relationship to his troubles. He followed Hestia along the path, which wound between low walls covered in flowering vines that released sweet fragrances as they passed. The goddess moved with quiet dignity, her bare feet making no sound on the luminous stone, her simple white peplos flowing behind her like water, like silk, like moonlight given fabric form. The path opened into a space that took Lysander's breath away. It was a garden, but unlike any garden he had seen on the mortal plane. The ground was covered not with ordinary grass but with something that resembled moss yet glowed faintly silver, creating a carpet of soft light that illuminated the space from below. Growing from this luminous ground were trees unlike anything in Lysander's experience. Their trunks were slender and silver white, their bark smooth as polished metal, and their branches spread in patterns that seemed almost geometric, as though they had been designed according to some mathematical principle of perfect proportion and balance. But what truly transformed the space from merely beautiful to transcendent were the leaves. Each leaf was shaped like a small crescent moon, perfectly formed, and they hung from the branches on threads so fine they were nearly invisible, creating the impression that hundreds of tiny moons floated in the air, suspended by nothing more than will or magic or the simple fact that on Olympus, such impossibilities were commonplace. The leaves moved in the gentle breeze, creating a sound like distant bells or wind chimes, a musical tinkling that was barely audible but utterly enchanting. And they glowed, not brightly, but with a soft luminescence that reminded Lysander of moonlight on water, of pearls seen through silk, of every gentle light he had ever witnessed. Among the trees grew flowers that complemented the lunar theme. They were low to the ground, clustering in beds and borders, and their petals held a blue sheen that shifted as Lysander looked at them, now deep indigo, now pale azure, now somewhere between blue and silver that had no name in human languages. The flowers opened and closed slowly, rhythmically, in synchronized patterns that created waves of color moving across the garden beds. It was like watching breathing made visible, like seeing the garden itself inhale and exhale in long, peaceful cycles that spoke of eternal patience and infinite time. The effect of the entire space was one of profound tranquility mixed with otherworldly beauty. This was not a garden designed for human enjoyment, though humans could certainly appreciate it. This was a place that existed for itself, that followed rules and aesthetics belonging to divine rather than mortal realms, that offered beauty as a form of prayer or perhaps as simply its natural state of being. As Lysander stood taking in the scene, a figure emerged from between the silver trees, walking with steps that left faint trails of light behind them, as though the ground remembered each place her feet had touched and glowed briefly in acknowledgement. She was tall and slender, her form draped in robes that seemed to be made of night itself, deep blue-black fabric that contained within it tiny points of light, like stars sewn into the cloth, so that she appeared to be wearing the cosmos itself as a garment. Her hair was long and pale, the color of moonlight, and it floated around her as though underwater or perhaps as though gravity affected it differently than it did other things. Her face was serene, beautiful in the way that moonlight is beautiful, not warm or inviting but cool, distant, perfect in its untouchability. And her eyes, when they met Lysander's, were luminous silver, seeming to glow from within with light that was ancient and patient and utterly knowing. This was Selene, goddess of the moon, keeper of night's gentle light, guardian of dreams and darkness and all things that dwelt in shadow and silver. Hestia bowed slightly to the moon goddess, a gesture of respect between equals rather than subordinate to superior. "Sister," she said warmly, "I bring you the traveler who sought Olympus tonight. He has rested at my hearth and released his burdens to the flame. Now he is ready for what you might offer." Selene's gaze remained fixed on Lysander, and though her expression didn't change, her face maintaining its serene, almost distant beauty, he sensed approval in her attention, acceptance, a willingness to engage that felt like a gift rather than an expectation. "You walk in shadows of your own making," Selene said, her voice like wind moving through night, like water flowing over stones in darkness, like every quiet sound that belongs to the hours between sunset and dawn. Each word was soft yet clear, carrying perfect articulation despite being barely above a whisper. Lysander felt the truth of her words settle into him. Yes, he walked in shadows of his own making. The worries he carried, the fears that haunted him, the anxieties that filled his mind, most of them were projections, imaginings, scenarios he created and then treated as though they were real. He was haunted by ghosts of his own conjuring, trapped in darkness he himself had created by forgetting to look for light. "Let me lend you the quiet of the moon," Selene continued, lifting her serene gaze to meet his fully. She raised one hand, her fingers long and graceful, and brushed them through the air before her as though stroking invisible strings or perhaps gathering something that existed in the atmosphere around them. As her fingers moved, tiny particles began to appear, motes of light so small they were barely visible individually but which together created a shimmering cloud, like dust caught in sunbeams but more delicate, more ethereal. The particles drifted toward Lysander, moving not in a straight line but in lazy spirals, dancing through the air as though they were alive, as though they were choosing their path rather than being blown by wind or pulled by gravity. They reminded him of snow falling on a windless day, of dandelion seeds floating on summer breezes, of every small, light thing that drifts and wanders without hurry or destination. When the first particle touched him, landing on his outstretched hand, he felt something unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not physical sensation exactly, though there was a faint tingling where the mote made contact. Instead, it was as though something shifted in his perception, in his awareness, in the very quality of his consciousness. More particles landed on him, on his arms, his shoulders, his face, and with each touch, the effect intensified. His mind, which had been somewhat quiet since the session at Hestia's hearth but still active, still generating thoughts and observations, began to grow profoundly still. Not empty, the stillness was not absence but presence, a positive quality rather than a void. It was the quietness of deep meditation, of perfect focus, of the moment when all internal chatter ceases and one exists simply as awareness, as presence, as consciousness without the constant commentary and interpretation that usually accompanies it. The shadows that Selene had mentioned, the ones of his own making, began to dissolve. Not because they were driven away but because they were seen clearly for what they were, insubstantial, temporary, less real than the light that revealed them. When examined in the moon's gentle illumination, they couldn't maintain their threatening presence, couldn't pretend to be solid or permanent or insurmountable. Lysander stood bathed in the falling star particles, and his mind grew clearer than it had been since childhood, since before he learned to worry, since before he understood that life could be difficult and disappointing, since before he built the elaborate structures of anxiety and defense that characterized adult consciousness. He felt like a calm sea at midnight, deep, vast, still, reflecting the heavens above with perfect clarity because no turbulence disturbed the surface. The moon's light penetrated the water, illuminating depths that usually remained hidden, showing him aspects of himself he had forgotten existed or perhaps had never known were there. "The moon teaches many lessons," Selene said softly, her voice weaving through the moment without disrupting it, adding to the experience rather than pulling attention away from it. "But perhaps the most important is this: not everything needs to be illuminated brightly. Some things are better seen in gentle light, in shadow and suggestion rather than harsh clarity." She paused, letting the words settle, and Lysander understood what she meant. He had been trying to solve everything, to understand everything, to shine harsh light on every problem and anxiety, believing that if he could only see clearly enough, think hard enough, analyze thoroughly enough, he could resolve everything that troubled him. But that approach had only created more shadows, had only generated more anxiety, because harsh light creates hard shadows, and the more intensely he examined his problems, the darker and more threatening they appeared. The moon's approach was different. It illuminated gently, revealed softly, showed enough to navigate but not so much that every detail became overwhelming. It taught the virtue of partial seeing, of accepting that some things would remain mysterious, that perfect understanding was neither possible nor necessary. "You cannot solve everything," Selene continued, confirming what Lysander was realizing. You cannot control everything. You cannot understand everything. And trying to do so only exhausts you, only creates the very chaos you seek to eliminate. The star particles continued to fall, and Lysander continued to receive them, each one bringing another moment of clarity, another instant of profound stillness. The effect was cumulative, building not toward some climax or dramatic transformation but toward a sustained state of peace, of quiet awareness, of being fully present without the need to analyze or judge or manage what was present. The moon does not struggle, Selene said, and now she was moving around him slowly, her steps leaving those faint trails of light, her robes flowing with movements that seemed to follow no physical laws but rather aesthetic ones, creating patterns for the sake of beauty rather than function. It rises and sets according to its nature. It waxes and wanes without resistance. It shines its light where it shines, illuminates what it illuminates, and does not concern itself with what remains in shadow. She stopped in front of him again, and her silver eyes held his with gentle intensity. You are not required to be the sun, she said. You do not need to illuminate everything, warm everything, sustain everything. You can be like the moon, present, constant, offering what you have to offer, but allowing much to remain in mystery, in shadow, in the quiet darkness that is not absence but simply another form of presence. The wisdom of her words penetrated deeply, striking something at Lysander's core that had been straining under impossible expectations, under the belief that he needed to be everything, do everything, handle everything perfectly. The permission to be less, to be gentler, to accept limitation and mystery, it felt like a revolutionary revelation, like being freed from a prison he hadn't known he was in. The star particles finally ceased their falling, though the effect they had created remained. Lysander stood in the garden of silent stars, beneath trees whose leaves were tiny moons, surrounded by flowers that breathed in rhythmic waves, and his mind was quieter than it had been since he could remember. Not empty, not absent, but still, profoundly, beautifully, perfectly still. Like a calm sea at midnight, reflecting the moon's gentle light, holding depths that didn't need to be explored to be real, existing in peace precisely because it had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. Selene smiled, the first change in her serene expression, and the smile transformed her from distant and cool to warm and present, bridging the gap between divine and human with simple acknowledgement of shared understanding. Carry this stillness with you, she said. When the shadows you create grow dark again, remember the moon's light. Remember that gentle illumination is often enough. Remember that mystery is not your enemy but your companion, that not knowing can be a form of wisdom rather than a failure. Lysander bowed to her, deeply and with profound gratitude, unable to find words adequate to express what he felt, what he had received, what had shifted inside him in this garden of lunar beauty. Selene inclined her head in return, then gestured toward a path leading from the garden in yet another direction. Your journey continues, she said. Others wait to offer their gifts. Go with my blessing, traveler, and may you walk always in the moon's gentle light. The Silent Temple of Wisdom. Lysander walked from the garden of silent stars with steps that felt lighter, more assured than before. The stillness Selene had granted him remained, settling into his awareness like a calm friend who had decided to stay, who required no conversation or attention but whose presence alone brought peace. The path he followed was made of white marble, smooth and cool beneath his feet, and it led him through a grove of olive trees whose leaves whispered secrets in a language he almost understood. The trees were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, yet they stood with dignity, their branches heavy with silver-green leaves and dark olives that gleamed in the eternal twilight of Olympus. Beyond the grove, the landscape opened onto a wide plaza paved with geometric patterns in stone, circles within squares, spirals that seemed to lead both inward and outward simultaneously, designs that suggested deep mathematical principles or perhaps symbolic meanings beyond Lysander's current understanding. And at the far end of this plaza stood a temple. It was not large or ostentatious. Unlike the grand temples mortals built to honor the gods, structures meant to impress with their scale and ornamentation, this building was modest in size, perhaps no larger than a comfortable house. Its proportions were perfect, each column and lintel placed with such precision that the eye found rest in looking at it, found satisfaction in the harmonious relationships between parts. The temple was built of white marble that seemed to glow from within, and its style was classical, a rectangular structure with a peaked roof supported by columns that rose with elegant simplicity. No elaborate carvings adorned its surfaces, no painted decorations or gilded accents. The beauty came from the purity of form, from the perfection of execution, from the way each element served its purpose without excess or deficiency. As Lysander approached, he noticed an owl perched on one of the temple's columns. It was large, with feathers that shifted between gray and white and the palest gold, and its eyes were enormous, bright, intelligent beyond what any natural bird should possess. The owl watched his approach with unblinking attention, its head swiveling to track his movement with that peculiar fluidity that owls possess, that makes them seem almost mechanical or perhaps magical in their movement. The temple's entrance was open, no door blocking access, and from within came a soft, steady light that suggested candles or lamps but which, Lysander suspected, might be something else entirely. Perhaps simply the natural luminescence that seemed to pervade everything on Olympus. He climbed the 3 steps leading to the entrance and paused at the threshold, feeling once again that sense of crossing from one space into another, from ordinary into sacred, from external into internal. Taking a breath, he stepped inside. The interior was even simpler than the exterior. The space was a single large room, rectangular, with a high ceiling supported by the same elegant columns that graced the outside. The floor was marble, polished to a mirror finish, and the walls were bare except for a few simple sconces that held the sourceless light he had suspected. And in the center of the room, seated on a simple wooden chair beside a low table, was a woman who could only be Athena. But this was not the Athena of war and strategy, not the armored goddess with shield and spear who led armies and toppled cities. This Athena wore a simple peplos of undyed linen, her dark hair bound back in a practical braid, her feet bare, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She looked young, perhaps in her late 20s by mortal reckoning, but her eyes held depths of knowledge and experience that spoke of ages beyond counting. Beside her chair, standing on a wooden perch, was the owl Lysander had seen outside. The bird had somehow moved from the exterior column to this interior position, or perhaps there were 2 owls, or perhaps on Olympus such questions about physical logistics were simply irrelevant. Athena regarded Lysander with clear, gentle eyes, gray like storm clouds but without threat, like morning mist but with substance. Her gaze was penetrating but not intrusive, seeing deeply but without judgment, observing everything but accepting what it observed without trying to change or fix it. "Welcome, traveler," she said, her voice measured and calm, carrying the quality of someone who had thought carefully before speaking and would speak only what needed to be said. "Please, sit with me a moment." She gestured to a chair opposite her own, and Lysander moved forward, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space. He sat, and found the wooden chair surprisingly comfortable despite its simplicity, its angles and proportions perfectly suited to the human form, as though it had been designed not just with aesthetic considerations but with genuine concern for the comfort of whoever might use it. Between them, the low table held nothing, no objects, no decorations, just smooth wood surface, unadorned and perfect in its plainness. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Not the silence of awkwardness or uncertainty, but something deeper, the silence of understanding, of two beings sharing space without the need to fill it with words or noise or activity. It was the silence of contemplation, of rest, of minds that were comfortable existing without constant stimulation or distraction. Lysander felt his thoughts continue to settle. At Hestia's hearth, his burdens had been acknowledged and temporarily lifted. In Selene's garden, his mind had found profound stillness. And now, here in Athena's temple, something else was happening, a clarification, perhaps, or a simplification, as though the goddess of wisdom was teaching him not through words but through simple presence, through the quality of the space she maintained, through the example of existing without strain or excess. The owl made a soft sound, not quite a hoot but a gentler vocalization, like a question asked in bird language. Athena smiled slightly at the sound, a warmth entering her expression that made her seem less like an immortal deity and more like simply a wise being who appreciated the company of other creatures. Even wisdom must rest, Athena finally said, breaking the silence with words that felt necessary rather than obligatory. Even the mind that seeks to understand everything must sometimes stop seeking and simply be. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture remaining upright but easing into something more relaxed. "Do you know what mortals most often misunderstand about wisdom?" she asked, though the question didn't seem to require an answer. "They think it is about knowing everything, understanding everything, having answers to all questions." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air between them, and Lysander found himself considering it, turning it over in his mind with the newfound clarity and stillness he had been given. "But true wisdom," Athena continued, "is often about knowing what not to think about, what questions not to ask, what problems to leave unsolved because they cannot be solved or because solving them would cost more than the solution would provide." The owl made another soft sound, as though agreeing with or perhaps commenting on this statement. "The mind," Athena said, "is a powerful tool. It can analyze, understand, create, solve. But like any tool, it is meant to be used and then set down. Many mortals, perhaps most, have forgotten how to set it down. They carry it constantly, wielding it against every experience, every moment, every perception, until they are exhausted by the effort and have forgotten what life is like when not filtered through constant analysis and interpretation." Lysander felt the truth of this observation settle into him with the weight of revelation. Yes, this was exactly what he had been doing, wielding his mind constantly, analyzing everything, trying to understand and solve and manage every aspect of his experience, until the tool that should have served him had become a burden that exhausted him. Athena reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. The touch was light, barely present, but it carried something, transmission of understanding, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement, recognition of what he was realizing. "No mind is meant to carry its thoughts alone," she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible in the quiet temple. "The thoughts you think, the worries you carry, the questions you ask, they are meant to be held lightly, examined when necessary, but also released, let go, allowed to pass through rather than being captured and held indefinitely. Her hand remained on his shoulder, and Lysander felt something shifting inside him, a loosening, a releasing, as though knots in his thinking were being gently untied, as though patterns of thought that had become rigid and habitual were being softened, made flexible again, returned to their natural state of fluidity. "Let them soften in the presence of calm," Athena continued, and now her voice had taken on a quality almost like song, like chant, like words that carried power beyond their literal meaning. "Let the thoughts you think be like water rather than stone, flowing, moving, taking shape but never becoming fixed, serving their purpose but never becoming permanent." The owl spread its wings, holding them extended for a moment before folding them back, and the gesture seemed significant somehow, as though the bird was demonstrating something, teaching through action what words could only approximate. Lysander sat with Athena's hand on his shoulder, and he felt his mind, which had been quieter since Selene's blessing but still present, still active, relax even further. The thoughts that moved through his awareness became less sticky, less insistent. They arose, were noted, and passed on, like clouds moving across sky, like leaves floating on a stream, like any transient phenomenon that appears and disappears without requiring intervention or management. And in the spaces between thoughts, he discovered something he had been seeking without knowing what it was: simple awareness, consciousness without content, the experience of existing without constantly thinking about existence, without narrating or interpreting or analyzing, just being present with whatever was present, accepting it, allowing it, not needing it to be different than it was. "This is the deepest wisdom," Athena said, her voice still soft but carrying complete certainty. "Not the accumulation of knowledge or the mastery of skills, valuable as those things are, but the ability to be still, to be present, to allow life to unfold without constantly trying to control or manage or understand it." She removed her hand from his shoulder, and though the physical contact ended, the effect of her touch remained, a lasting loosening, a permanent softening, as though she had taught his mind a new way of being that would persist even after he left this temple, even after he descended from Olympus and returned to the mortal world. They sat together in silence again, but this silence was different from before. Earlier, it had been the silence of two beings in the same space. Now, it was something more, a shared experience of pure being, of consciousness resting in itself, of minds that had stopped their constant activity and discovered the peace that existed beneath thought, beneath worry, beneath the endless stream of mental content that usually occupied awareness. The owl hooted softly, a sound of contentment or perhaps approval, and its call echoed gently in the marble space before fading into the stillness. After a time, how long, Lysander couldn't say and didn't care. Athena stood, and he understood that this portion of his journey was complete, that he had received what this temple and this goddess had to offer. He stood as well, and though no words of farewell were spoken, he felt the depth of what had passed between them, the significance of the gift he had been given. Athena inclined her head in acknowledgement, the owl bobbed on its perch, and Lysander found himself backing toward the entrance, reluctant to turn away from the goddess's presence but understanding that it was time to continue, that other experiences awaited. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. Athena had returned to her seat, her hands resting in her lap, her expression serene, and she looked like nothing so much as someone engaged in meditation, in contemplation, in the practice of being still and allowing wisdom to emerge not from effort but from rest. The image stayed with him as he stepped back out into the plaza, as he walked away from the temple of wisdom, carrying with him not new knowledge but something far more valuable, the understanding of how to let his mind rest, How to allow thoughts to pass through without clinging to them, how to exist in peace regardless of what thoughts or circumstances arose. The stillness deepened, the peace expanded, and Lysander continued his journey through Olympus, wondering what other gifts the gods might offer to a mortal who had climbed seeking answers and was instead finding something far more precious: the cessation of questions, the peace of not needing to know, the wisdom of simply being. The Sky Court of Zeus and Hera. The path from Athena's temple led Lysander through a colonnade of white marble pillars, their surfaces carved with subtle spiral patterns that drew the eye upward, encouraging contemplation of heights, of ascension, of the eternal reaching toward the infinite that characterized both mortal aspiration and divine existence. As he walked, Lysander noticed that the quality of light was changing. The eternal twilight that had suffused most of Olympus was brightening slightly, taking on a more golden tone, as though he was approaching some source of radiance, some center from which illumination emanated outward to touch everything in this realm. The colonnade opened onto a wide terrace, and Lysander stopped, his breath catching at the sight before him. The terrace was the highest point on Olympus, or at least felt like it, though on this strange realm where normal spatial relationships seemed flexible, height might be more a quality than a measurement. It overlooked everything, providing a view that seemed to encompass not just the immediate landscape but vast distances, perhaps infinite distances, as though from this vantage point one could see not just space but time, not just what was but what had been and what might be. Below the terrace, clouds stretched in every direction like an endless sea, their surfaces catching light and reflecting it in shades of white and silver and gold. The clouds moved in slow, stately patterns, forming and reforming, creating shapes that almost suggested meaning, faces, symbols, scenes from stories, before dissolving and becoming something else. Above, the silver sky had brightened to a pale blue-white, and the stars that had been visible earlier had faded, not gone but dimmed, as though making way for something that required different illumination, different atmosphere. And at the center of this terrace, seated on thrones that were simultaneously simple and magnificent, were Zeus and Hera. But these were not the gods of storm and sovereignty that mortals depicted in their myths and temples. There was no thunder in Zeus's hands, no lightning crackling around him, no sense of barely contained power waiting to be unleashed. And Hera wore no expression of jealous pride or imperial disdain, no crown of peacock feathers or elaborate robes designed to emphasize status and dominion. Instead, they sat quietly together, side by side, dressed in simple white garments that might have belonged to any prosperous but not ostentatious household. Zeus's beard was shorter than artistic tradition usually depicted it, neatly trimmed, his face weathered but kind, his eyes bright with intelligence but also warmth. Hera's beauty was understated rather than dramatic, her hair bound simply, her posture relaxed, her expression carrying a quality of patience and understanding rather than judgment or assessment. Zeus's thunderbolt, the weapon that could split mountains and scatter armies, rested beside his throne, but it was unlit, dormant, more artifact than armament, a symbol of power that need not be wielded to be acknowledged. Hera's crown sat on a small table beside her, and though it glowed faintly with soft golden light, it seemed to be there more as ornament than as statement of authority. They were not rulers in this moment, Lysander understood. They were keepers, guardians of harmony, maintainers of balance, beings whose primary function was not to command or control but to ensure that the great patterns continued, that the cosmic order maintained its equilibrium, that chaos and order, freedom and structure, continued their eternal dance in proper proportion. As Lysander approached, Uncertain whether he should bow or kneel or simply wait to be acknowledged, Hera turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were deep brown, warm, and they held an understanding that was almost maternal but more vast, as though she understood not just him specifically but all mortals, all seeking, all the struggles and triumphs of beings who lived finite lives in an infinite universe. "You fear change," Hera said softly, her voice carrying easily across the terrace despite being barely above conversational volume, as though on Olympus sound traveled according to intention rather than mere physics. The statement landed in Lysander's awareness with the weight of absolute truth. Yes, beneath all his other concerns, beneath the specific worries and anxieties that filled his days, was a fundamental fear of change, of the unknown, of transformation, of the way life refused to remain stable and predictable, constantly shifting, constantly demanding adaptation, constantly requiring that he release what was familiar and embrace what was new. He had been trying to hold everything still, he realized. Trying to maintain control, to keep his life in a configuration he understood, to prevent the inevitable transformations that time and circumstance brought. And that effort, that constant resistance to natural change, had been exhausting him, creating much of the stress and anxiety he carried. But change is only the next step of destiny, Hera continued, and now she smiled gently, reassuringly, the way a wise elder might smile at a child who is frightened of something that holds no real danger. Not something foreign or threatening, but simply the unfolding of what already exists in potential, the blooming of seeds that were planted long ago, the natural progression of patterns that have always been in motion. Zeus shifted in his throne, leaning forward slightly, his own gaze now fixed on Lysander with interest that felt genuine rather than merely polite. When he spoke, his voice was deep but not booming, strong but not overwhelming, carrying authority that came from wisdom rather than force. "And destiny," Zeus added, his tone thoughtful, almost conversational, "is quieter than you think." The phrase struck Lysander as profound, opening something in his understanding. He had imagined destiny, if he thought about it at all, as something dramatic, something that manifested in great moments and significant events, in choices that clearly mattered and consequences that were immediately apparent. But Zeus was suggesting something different. Destiny was quiet. It unfolded not in thunder and lightning but in whispers, in subtle adjustments, in the accumulation of small moments that seemed insignificant individually but which together shaped the course of a life, directed the flow of events toward outcomes that had always been approaching but which could not be forced or hurried. "You seek to control what cannot be controlled," Zeus said, his voice remaining gentle despite the directness of the observation. "You try to know what cannot yet be known. You attempt to prevent what must inevitably occur. And in doing so, you work against the very forces that would carry you forward if you would only allow them to do so." A breeze moved across the terrace, warm and carrying scents of distant places, ocean salt and mountain stone, flower gardens and rain-soaked earth. The breeze seemed to carry Zeus's words with it, distributing them not just to Lysander's ears but throughout the space, as though the air itself was being instructed, was receiving and internalizing this wisdom. "The universe has patterns," Hera said, and now she too leaned forward, her attention fully focused on Lysander with an intensity that was not uncomfortable but felt like being seen, truly seen, by eyes that missed nothing but judged nothing. "Rhythms that govern how things unfold. Trying to work against these patterns is like trying to swim against an ocean current, exhausting, frustrating, ultimately futile. But moving with the patterns," Zeus continued, the two gods speaking in a kind of alternating harmony, as though they were two voices expressing a single thought, allowing yourself to be carried by the currents that were always going to carry you anyway. That is wisdom. That is peace. That is living in alignment with destiny rather than in resistance to it. Hera gestured, and a breeze rose in response to her movement, not because she commanded it but because she was so attuned to the natural forces of this realm that her gesture and the wind's movement were synchronized, were part of the same pattern, were expressions of the same underlying harmony. The breeze carried with it a feeling, difficult to describe but impossible to mistake, of release, of letting go, of ceasing to resist. Lysander felt something in him that had been tight, clenched, holding on desperately to control uncertainty, begin to loosen, to soften, to open to the possibility that perhaps he didn't need to manage everything, to direct everything, to ensure everything unfolded according to his plans and preferences. The fear of change, Hera said, her voice taking on a quality almost like song, is really fear of loss, of losing what you have, who you are, the life you know. But you cannot lose what is truly yours. What belongs to your essential self remains regardless of external change. What you fear losing is temporary anyway, was always going to pass, was never meant to be permanent. Zeus nodded agreement. Everything changes, he said simply. Mountains wear down. Seas expand and contract. Stars are born and die. Empires rise and fall. And individual lives move through their own cycles of transformation, each phase giving way to the next, each ending making room for a new beginning. This is not tragedy, Hera added. This is simply how existence functions. Resisting it doesn't prevent change, it only makes the changing more difficult, more painful, more exhausting. Lysander stood before the two gods, receiving their wisdom, and he felt layers of resistance beginning to dissolve. The fear of change, which had been with him for so long that he had mistaken it for a fundamental part of his personality, revealed itself as simply a pattern of thought, a habit of mind, something that could be released like any other temporary condition. What would happen if he stopped resisting? If he allowed life to unfold as it would unfold? If he trusted that the patterns Zeus and Hera spoke of were real, were reliable, would carry him where he needed to go even if he couldn't see the destination clearly? The thought was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant relinquishing control, accepting uncertainty, moving forward without guarantees. But liberating because it meant he could stop fighting, stop straining, stop exhausting himself in the futile attempt to prevent what could not be prevented. Zeus stood from his throne, not abruptly but with the same easy grace that characterized all his movements, and approached Lysander. Up close, the god was tall but not impossibly so, strong but not threatening, radiating presence that came from being fully embodied, fully present, fully comfortable with exactly who and what he was. He placed a hand on Lysander's head, the touch gentle, almost fatherly, and Lysander felt something shift at a level deeper than thought, deeper than emotion, somewhere in the foundational structure of how he related to existence itself. You have permission, Zeus said quietly, to stop controlling. To stop managing. To stop resisting what wants to happen. The patterns will carry you. The currents will move you. Destiny will unfold as it was always going to unfold. And you will be fine, more than fine, because you will be moving with the flow rather than against it. Hera joined them, standing beside her husband, and she placed her hand over Zeus's, so that both gods were touching Lysander simultaneously, and the combined effect was overwhelming, not in the sense of too much but in the sense of complete, of sufficient, of exactly what was needed. Go forward without fear, Hera said. Change will come. Transformation will occur. But you are not alone in this. The patterns support you. The rhythms carry you. And we, all of us who maintain the balance, we ensure that change, though constant, remains within parameters that allow for growth rather than chaos, for evolution rather than destruction. The two gods stepped back, their hands lifting from Lysander's head, and he felt simultaneously lighter and more grounded, as though some great weight had been removed while his connection to solid foundation had been strengthened. Zeus returned to his throne, and as he sat, a breeze rose again, this one carrying the words they had spoken, lifting them up and out, dispersing them across the endless sea of clouds below. The words became part of the atmosphere of Olympus, joined the accumulated wisdom that saturated this place, became available to anyone who might climb here seeking peace and find instead transformation. Lysander stood before the gods, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt no fear about the future. Not because he knew what would happen, he didn't, but because he had been given permission, had been granted understanding, had received blessing to stop trying to control what could not be controlled and instead trust in patterns larger and wiser than his individual will. The fear of change dissolved, not because change would no longer occur but because he no longer needed to resist it, no longer needed to see it as enemy rather than simply as the natural movement of existence through time. Hera smiled at him, Zeus nodded with approval, and though no words of dismissal were spoken, Lysander understood that this encounter was complete, that he had received what they had to offer, that his journey through Olympus was approaching its conclusion. He bowed deeply to both gods, holding the position long enough to convey the depth of his gratitude, then straightened and turned, walking back across the terrace, leaving behind the highest point of Olympus and the beings who maintained its eternal balance, carrying with him the blessing of accepting change, the wisdom of trusting in patterns beyond his comprehension, the peace of knowing that destiny, though quiet and often invisible, was real and reliable and would carry him forward if he would only allow it to do so. A feast of peace, not splendor. As Lysander descended from the sky court, following a path that seemed to know where he needed to go even when he didn't, he became aware of sounds drifting through the air, gentle sounds, welcoming sounds, the kind that spoke of gathering in companionship rather than ceremony or obligation. The murmur of quiet conversation. The soft clink of ceramic against ceramic. The occasional note of laughter, brief and warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. And beneath it all, a quality of contentment, of beings at ease in each other's presence, sharing space without tension or performance. The path opened onto a courtyard unlike the grand spaces he had encountered elsewhere on Olympus. This was intimate, domestic almost, enclosed by low walls covered in climbing vines whose flowers released subtle fragrances into the air, jasmine and honeysuckle, lavender and something else he couldn't name but which reminded him of summer evenings and childhood contentment. In the center of the courtyard stood a long table, simple in construction, made of dark wood polished smooth by age and use. Around the table were benches rather than elaborate chairs, and seated on these benches were several of the gods he had already met, along with a few others whose presence he could feel even if he couldn't immediately identify them. Hestia was there, of course, at one end of the table, her position suggesting not authority but simply that she had arrived first, or perhaps that hosting was her natural role, the function that brought her joy. Selene sat nearby, her luminous presence softened in this intimate setting, less distant goddess and more gentle companion. Athena occupied another seat, her owl perched on the bench beside her, and she was engaged in quiet conversation with a figure whose form seemed to shift between male and female, young and old, suggesting fluidity of identity that transcended fixed categories. And there were others, presences he sensed more than saw clearly, gods and goddesses who had chosen to observe rather than directly engage, or perhaps whose turn to offer wisdom would come at another time, for another traveler. The courtyard felt comfortably populated without being crowded, intimate without being confined. As Lysander hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether he was intruding on a private gathering, Hestia looked up and smiled, gesturing for him to approach. "Come," she said warmly. "Join us. We have been waiting for you." He walked toward the table, and as he did, space seemed to open for him, not by anyone moving, but by the space itself adjusting, accommodating, making room in the way that Olympus seemed to do naturally, as though the realm itself was conscious and responsive to need. He found himself seated between Hestia and Selene, the two goddesses flanking him like gentle guardians, and as he settled onto the bench, he felt the last remnants of tension leave his body. The wood beneath him was smooth and warm, shaped by countless hands over countless meals, and sitting on it felt like coming home, like being welcomed to a table where he had always belonged but had somehow forgotten he had a place. The food on the table was not the elaborate feast he might have expected from divine beings. There was no ambrosia served in golden bowls, no nectar poured from jeweled vessels. Instead, the meal was simple, composed of elements that any mortal household might serve: fresh bread still warm from baking, its crust golden and crackling, its interior soft and fragrant with wheat and yeast. There were bowls of olives, dark and glistening with oil, their flavor rich and complex, tasting of sun and soil and centuries of cultivation. Plates held fresh fruit, grapes clustered like small purple jewels, figs split open to reveal their sweet pink flesh, apples whose skin gleamed red and gold in the soft light. Honeycomb rested on a simple ceramic dish, the honey still liquid and golden, catching light and holding it, and beside it was cheese, white and crumbly, tasting of milk and salt and the mountain pastures where the sheep that produced it must have grazed. Wine filled simple clay cups, not fine crystal or elaborate pottery but vessels that were functional and honest, their shape designed for use rather than display. The wine itself was neither too sweet nor too dry, either too strong nor too weak, but perfectly balanced, refreshing without overwhelming, enhancing the meal without dominating it. And water, clear, cool water in earthenware pitchers, as important as the wine, perhaps more so, reminding everyone present that the most essential needs are often the simplest, that sustenance need not be complicated to be complete. The gods ate, and their eating was unhurried, appreciative, mindful. They broke bread with their hands, sharing pieces across the table. They passed bowls and plates, offering food to one another with simple gestures of care. They poured wine and water, ensuring everyone's cup was filled, attending to each other's needs with the kind of effortless hospitality that comes from genuine interest in others' comfort rather than from obligation or social convention. And they spoke little. Not from awkwardness or lack of connection, but because the gathering was not about conversation or the exchange of ideas. It was about presence, about sharing space and time and sustenance, about the simple act of being together without agenda or purpose beyond the companionship itself. When words were spoken, they were brief, gentle, often accompanied by smiles or small gestures that conveyed meaning beyond language. A comment about the quality of the bread. An appreciation for the honey's sweetness. A shared memory, lightly touched upon and then released, like a stone skipped across water, touching the surface but not diving deep. Lysander ate, and as he did, he realized he was tasting memory. The bread reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, of watching her hands knead dough, of the smell that filled the house when loaves were baking. The olives carried echoes of summers spent in his uncle's village, of afternoons sitting in the shade of ancient trees, of learning to appreciate flavors that were complex rather than simply sweet. The honey tasted like childhood evenings, like the reward his mother would give him after a day of good behavior, letting him have a small spoonful before bed, the sweetness lingering on his tongue as he drifted toward sleep. The wine held the warmth of celebration, of family gatherings and moments of joy, of toasts raised to mark occasions both significant and mundane. The food was not just sustenance. It was connection, was memory made tangible, was every good meal he had ever shared, every moment of nourishment both physical and emotional, distilled and represented in these simple elements arranged on a wooden table under an eternal sky. He looked around at the gods gathered here, and for the first time since arriving on Olympus, he saw them not as beings fundamentally different from himself, not as distant powers to be feared or worshipped, but simply as conscious entities who existed in relationship, who valued connection, who found meaning in the same basic acts that gave meaning to mortal life, sharing food, offering companionship, being present with others in moments of peace and rest. The owl hopped from its perch beside Athena and walked along the table, its talons clicking softly on wood, until it reached Lysander. There it stopped and looked at him with those enormous eyes, and Lysander understood that he was being observed, assessed, but with curiosity rather than judgment, with interest rather than evaluation. He reached out slowly and stroked the owl's feathered head, feeling the softness beneath his fingers, and the bird made a sound that was almost like purring, leaning into the touch, accepting the connection being offered. Hestia placed her hand briefly on Lysander's shoulder, a gesture of warmth and acknowledgement, and when she spoke, her voice was soft enough that only he could hear. "This is what we wished you to understand," she said. "That peace is not found in grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but in simple moments like this, sharing a meal, offering presents, receiving what is offered with gratitude and grace." Lysander nodded, unable to speak around the emotion that had gathered in his throat. Yes, this was what he had been seeking without knowing it, not answers to his problems, not solutions to his circumstances, but simply this, the experience of being present, being welcomed, being part of something that didn't demand or require or expect anything beyond his simple participation. The meal continued, and time once again became fluid, elastic, unmeasured. It might have lasted minutes or hours. It didn't matter. What mattered was the quality of the experience, the texture of connection, the depth of peace that settled over the gathering like a blessing. As the meal drew naturally toward its conclusion, not by anyone finishing or leaving, but by a collective sense that what needed to happen had happened, that sufficiency had been reached, Hestia stood and moved to stand beside Lysander. She took his hand in both of hers, holding it gently, and her touch was warm, steady, grounding. "You belong to the world below," she said kindly, and though her words spoke of separation, of departure, there was no sadness in them, only recognition of what was true and necessary. "But the peace you found here will walk with you." She released his hand and touched his chest, directly over his heart. "It lives here now," she said. "Not as a memory but as a reality. You can return to this peace whenever you choose, not by climbing mountains but by simply stopping, breathing, remembering that beneath all the noise and hurry, this stillness remains, always accessible, always waiting." The other gods stood as well, forming a loose circle around him, and though no formal farewell was spoken, he felt their blessing, their acknowledgement, their wish that what he had received would endure and serve him in the days and years ahead. Selene stepped forward and touched his forehead, where she had blessed him earlier in her garden. "Carry the moon's light," she whispered. "Remember that gentle illumination is enough." Athena came next, placing her hand briefly on his head. "Let your mind rest," she said. "Trust that understanding will come when needed." And though Zeus and Hera were not physically present in the courtyard, Lysander felt their presence nonetheless, felt the continuation of their blessing, the permission they had granted to stop resisting change, to trust in patterns beyond his comprehension. The gods stepped back, creating space, and Lysander understood it was time to leave, time to begin the journey back to the mortal world, carrying with him everything he had been given, the release of burdens, the stillness of mind, the acceptance of change, the simple peace of shared presence. He bowed to each of them, holding each god's gaze for a moment, communicating gratitude that went beyond words, appreciation for gifts that transcended description. And then he turned toward the path that would lead him down from Olympus, back through the gates he had entered, back to the mountain slope and eventually to the world below, transformed in ways both obvious and subtle, blessed in ways he was only beginning to understand, carrying peace like a flame that, once lit, could never be completely extinguished, even in the darkest times ahead. The descent through the dreaming sky. The path that led away from the courtyard was different from any Lysander had walked before on Olympus. Where previous paths had been solid stone or marble, clearly defined and stable, this one seemed to be made of something more ephemeral, perhaps solidified cloud, or crystallized mist, or simply intention given enough substance to support footsteps. It glowed faintly with its own light, a soft blue-white luminescence that marked its course through a landscape that had become dreamlike, less defined than the realms he had traversed earlier. The boundaries between solid and insubstantial, between here and there, between now and then, had grown permeable, as though he was moving through a transitional space, a zone between Olympus and the mortal world where neither set of rules fully applied. As he walked, Lysander became aware that he was not descending in a strictly physical sense. Yes, his feet moved, yes, he traveled forward, but the journey was taking place on multiple levels simultaneously, through space but also through states of consciousness, through geography but also through understanding, through the external world but also through the internal landscape of his own transformed awareness. The silver sky above began to shift, its uniform luminescence breaking into layers, into strata of different qualities of light. Some layers were pale gold, others soft rose, still others a blue so delicate it was almost white. They moved past each other like silk scarves blown by gentle wind, creating patterns that were beautiful without being structured, organized without being rigid. And through these layers, Lysander began to see things, not with his physical eyes but with some other form of perception that had opened during his time among the gods. He saw memories, both his own and perhaps others, drifting like leaves on water. He saw possibilities, futures that might unfold depending on choices not yet made. He saw patterns, the great rhythms Zeus and Hera had spoken of, made visible as geometric forms that pulsed and flowed in cosmic time. But none of it was overwhelming. The stillness that had been gifted to him remained steady, creating a center of calm from which he could observe all this without being swept away by it, without losing himself in the vastness of what was being revealed. Clouds began to gather around the path, but these were different from the mist that had accompanied his ascent. They were warmer, softer, and they parted gently as he moved through them, like curtains being drawn aside by invisible hands. Through the gaps in the clouds, he could glimpse the world below beginning to reappear, no longer the view from an impossible height but the familiar geography of mountains and valleys, of forests and fields, of the land where mortals lived their lives. The light grew warmer, richer, taking on the quality of dawn, though Lysander couldn't tell if it was actually morning or if this was simply the light that existed at the boundary between realms, the illumination that belonged to transitions and thresholds. As he descended, he felt the blessings he had received settling deeper into his being, integrating, becoming not just experiences he had undergone but fundamental changes in how he existed, how he perceived, how he moved through the world. Hestia's gift of released burdens had taught him that he could set things down, that carrying everything constantly was choice rather than necessity. That lesson was becoming part of him now, changing not just his thoughts about stress and responsibility but his actual relationship to them, his visceral response to the weight of living. Selene's blessing of stillness had shown him what existed beneath the constant churning of thought, had revealed the peace that was always present when mind quieted enough to notice it. That understanding was sinking into his awareness, becoming accessible not just as a memory but as a state he could return to, a home base for consciousness that would remain available regardless of external circumstances. Athena's teaching about the mind's need for rest, about thoughts being allowed to flow rather than being held rigidly, had fundamentally altered something in how his awareness operated. He could feel it, a looseness, a flexibility, a willingness to let things pass through rather than capturing and keeping every thought, every worry, every observation. And the blessing from Zeus and Hera, the permission to stop resisting change, to trust in patterns larger than his understanding, that was perhaps the deepest transformation of all, touching something at the root of how he related to existence itself, shifting from opposition and control to acceptance and trust. All of these gifts were becoming part of him, not as additions but as revelations of what had always been possible, what had always been available but which he had forgotten or never known how to access. The path wound through cloudscapes that grew increasingly substantial, increasingly similar to the ordinary fog that gathered in mountain valleys at dawn. Lysander could feel the air changing, becoming more familiar, more like the atmosphere he had known all his life. The thin, sweet air of Olympus was giving way to something denser, richer with moisture and the sense of living earth. And gradually, through the mist, he began to see trees, not the impossible silver trees of Selene's garden or the ancient olives of Athena's grove, but ordinary mountain trees, pines and firs, their dark forms emerging from the fog like the masts of ships appearing through morning haze. His feet touched stone, not the luminous marble of Olympus but rough mountain rock, cold and solid, undeniably real in the way that mortal world was real. The transition was so gradual he couldn't identify a specific moment when it occurred, but he knew he had crossed back, had returned from the realm of gods to the realm of humans, carrying with him gifts that would remain even though the geography had changed. The mist began to thin, dawnlight, actual dawnlight from the mortal sun, breaking through in shafts and beams that painted the mountainside in gold and rose. Lysander could see the path now, the same rough track he had climbed the evening before, though it seemed like a lifetime ago, as though years had passed in the night rather than mere hours. He walked downward, his steps sure despite the rough terrain, and as he descended, the transformation of the landscape continued. The ethereal beauty of Olympus faded, replaced by the more rugged loveliness of the natural world, moss-covered rocks, wildflowers growing in cracks, the morning calls of birds greeting the day, the rustle of small animals moving through undergrowth. It was beautiful in its own way, Lysander realized. Different from Olympus, less transcendent, more immediate and tangible, but beautiful nonetheless. And more than beautiful, it was real, was home, was the world where he belonged and where he had work to do, life to live, relationships to nurture, challenges to meet. But he was returning to that world changed, transformed, blessed. The noise that had filled his mind for so long remained quieter, and when it threatened to rise again, he found he knew how to let it settle, how to access the stillness beneath it. The burdens he had carried were still there in the sense that his life circumstances hadn't magically altered, but his relationship to them had shifted profoundly, and that shift made all the difference. As he emerged from the last wisps of mist, stepping onto a clear section of mountainside where sunlight fell warm and golden, Lysander paused and looked back up toward Olympus. The summit was hidden once more behind clouds and distance, invisible to ordinary sight, looking like nothing more than a tall mountain peak, remarkable for its height but not obviously different from countless other mountains scattered across Greece and the wider world. But Lysander knew better now. He knew what dwelt there, knew what waited for those who climbed with the right intentions and found the gates open to receive them. And he knew, with certainty that came from direct experience rather than belief or hope, that the gods were real, that they dwelt still in their realm above the clouds, that they offered blessing and wisdom to mortals who sought them, not demanding worship or sacrifice but simply offering presence, offering teaching, offering the peace that came from remembering what was true beneath the chaos of ordinary living. A breeze moved across the mountainside, warm and carrying scents of the world below, olive groves and wheat fields, the distant sea, villages waking to a new day. The breeze felt like a final touch, a last blessing, a reminder that what he had received was not confined to the heights but would accompany him into the valleys, into the plains, into the everyday world where life unfolded in all its complexity and challenge. Lysander smiled, genuinely smiled, for perhaps the first time in months. Not because his problems had been solved or his circumstances had changed, but because he had been given something more valuable than solutions. He had been given perspective, had been shown what existed beneath and beyond the problems, had been reminded of truths that made the problems seem less overwhelming, less capable of defining his entire existence. He touched his chest, feeling his heart beating steady and strong, and whispered a quiet thank you to the gods he could no longer see but whose presence he would carry always, whose teachings had become part of him, whose peace would remain accessible as long as he remembered to stop, to breathe, to return to the stillness that dwelt at the center of his being. Then he turned away from the mountain and began the final portion of his descent, walking toward the world of humans, toward his life, toward whatever waited for him in the days and years ahead, blessed and transformed, carrying Olympus with him not as a place he had visited but as a truth he had discovered, a reality that would inform everything that came after, a gift that, once received, could never be completely lost. The sun rose higher, burning off the last of the morning mist, and Lysander walked down the mountain path with steps that were lighter than when he had climbed, with a mind that was quieter than it had been in years, with a heart that had remembered what peace felt like and would not forget again, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Below, the world spread out in all its complicated beauty, waiting for his return, ready to receive him as he was now, changed, blessed, carrying stillness like a flame that would burn gently but persistently, illuminating his path forward with the soft, steady light he had been given by gods who understood that the greatest gifts are often the simplest, that the most profound transformations happen not through dramatic intervention but through gentle teaching, through presence offered and received, through the quiet blessing of being seen, being welcomed, being reminded of what was always true but which the noise of living had temporarily obscured. Lysander walked on, and morning light followed him, and somewhere above, hidden in clouds and distance, Olympus remained, eternal and patient, waiting for the next soul who would find their way to its gates, seeking peace and finding instead something far more precious, the truth of their own nature, the possibility of stillness, the blessing of remembering what they had always known but temporarily forgotten. A heart at rest. By the time Lysander reached the base of Mount Olympus, the morning had fully established itself. The sun hung above the eastern horizon, its light golden and warm, painting the landscape in colors that seemed more vivid than he remembered, the green of olive groves more luminous, the blue of distant sea more saturated, the earth itself appearing richer, more alive, as though his transformed perception had granted him new eyes to see what had always been present but which he had been too distracted to fully notice. The village at the mountain's base was stirring to life. Smoke rose from chimneys as breakfast fires were kindled. Doors opened and people emerged to begin their daily routines. A shepherd led his flock toward distant pastures, the bells around the sheep's necks creating a gentle musical accompaniment to the morning. Women drew water from the communal well, their voices rising in conversation and occasional laughter. It was all so ordinary, so beautifully, perfectly ordinary, and Lysander found himself moved by the simple wonder of it, people living their lives, performing tasks that had been performed for generations, connected to the land and the seasons and each other through rhythms that predated cities and civilization, that reached back to the earliest days of human existence. He walked through the village, acknowledging the few people who noticed him with small nods and gentle smiles. They looked at him with curiosity. He was clearly not a local, his clothes marking him as someone from the city, his presence unexplained, but also with a fundamental hospitality that characterized these mountain communities, where travelers were welcomed rather than viewed with suspicion, where strangers were offered water and directions and kindness without expectation of return. An elderly woman sweeping her doorstep looked up as he passed and studied him for a moment before speaking. "You climbed the mountain," she said, not asking but stating, as though she could see evidence of his journey in his bearing or his expression, or perhaps simply knew from long experience what brought people to this remote village. "I did," Lysander confirmed, stopping to give her the respect her age and directness deserved. She nodded slowly, leaning on her broom, her eyes sharp and knowing despite the wrinkles that surrounded them. "And did you find what you sought?" Lysander considered the question, turning it over in his mind, examining his experience from different angles as Athena might have taught him to do, but without grasping, without straining, allowing the answer to emerge naturally. "I found more than I sought," he said finally. "I went looking for peace, and I found understanding. Blessing. A way of being that I had forgotten was possible." The woman smiled, her weathered face transforming with the expression, and Lysander saw in that smile recognition, acknowledgement, as though she knew exactly what he meant, as though perhaps she had once made her own journey up that mountain, or knew others who had, or simply understood from long life what it meant to seek and find and be changed by the seeking. "Then you were meant to climb," she said simply. "The mountain does not open its gates to everyone. That you were welcomed means you were ready, means you needed what waited there, means the gods saw in you someone worth teaching." She returned to her sweeping, dismissing him not rudely but with the efficiency of someone who had said what needed saying and saw no purpose in elaboration. Lysander bowed to her slightly and continued through the village, her words staying with him, confirming what he had already sensed, that his experience had been gift, not accident, that he had been granted something precious that should be honored and integrated rather than simply filed away as unusual experience or strange dream. Beyond the village, the path led through olive groves where ancient trees stood in ordered rows, their twisted trunks and silver-green leaves creating patterns of light and shadow that were restful to the eye. Lysander walked slowly, in no hurry to reach his destination, wherever that was, for he realized he had no specific plan for what came next, no clear sense of where he should go or what he should do. But rather than causing anxiety, as such uncertainty would have only yesterday. The lack of specific plan felt liberating, felt aligned with the teaching Zeus and Hera had offered about trusting patterns, about allowing destiny to unfold rather than trying to force it into predetermined shapes. He found himself drawn to a particular spot, a small rise overlooking the olive groves, where the grass grew thick and soft, where a single large tree provided shade, where the view extended across the agricultural lands toward the distant shimmer of the sea. He sat down, leaning back against the tree trunk, feeling its solid presence supporting him. The bark was rough against his back, the grass cool beneath him, and the morning breeze carried scents of earth and growing things, of salt water and wild herbs, of everything that made this land what it was. From this vantage point, he could see Mount Olympus rising in the distance behind him, its summit still hidden in clouds that might be ordinary weather or might be the eternal veil that separated the realm of gods from the vision of mortals. The mountain looked both near and far, both part of this landscape and somehow separate from it, both ordinary and sacred. Lysander closed his eyes, not to sleep but simply to rest, to be present with this moment, to allow himself to exist without purpose or goal or destination. The stillness that Selene had blessed him with remained accessible, and he sank into it now, feeling his mind quiet, his body relax, his entire being settling into a state of profound peace. The burdens he had carried to Olympus were still part of his life, his circumstances hadn't magically changed, his responsibilities hadn't disappeared, the challenges that awaited him in the city remained real and demanding. But his relationship to all of it had shifted so fundamentally that they no longer felt overwhelming, no longer dominated his entire awareness, no longer defined who he was or determined whether he could experience peace. He could carry them without being crushed by them. He could meet them without being consumed by them. He could live with uncertainty and challenge and imperfection without it destroying the essential okayness that he had rediscovered, that had always been present but which the noise of living had obscured. A bird landed on a branch above him, its song bright and clear, and Lysander listened without analyzing, without identifying the species or interpreting the meaning, simply receiving the sound as gift, as beauty, as one of the countless small perfections that filled the world for those who had learned to notice them. Time passed in its new, flexible way, no longer the rigid march of minutes and hours that characterized city life, but something more organic, more responsive to experience than to clocks. The sun climbed higher, its warmth increasing but remaining comfortable, and Lysander remained beneath the tree, resting in a way he hadn't rested in years, perhaps in his entire adult life. He thought about the gods he had met, Hestia with her quiet warmth, Selene with her gentle illumination, Athena with her wisdom about rest, Zeus and Hera with their understanding of change and pattern. They had not solved his problems or removed his challenges or guaranteed his future would be easy. They had done something better. They had reminded him of truths he had forgotten, had shown him capacities he hadn't known he possessed, had blessed him with perspectives that would serve him regardless of what circumstances arose. And they had offered these gifts not because he had earned them or deserved them, not because he had performed the right rituals or made the proper sacrifices, but simply because he had climbed seeking peace, because he had been open to receiving, because something in him had been ready for transformation even if he hadn't consciously known it. That generosity moved him deeply. The gods could have remained hidden, could have closed their gates, could have let him wander the mountain and return unchanged. But they had welcomed him, had taken time, though time meant something different to immortals, to teach him, to bless him, to offer what he needed rather than what he thought he wanted. He would honor that gift, he promised himself in them, wherever they were. He would remember what he had been taught. He would access the stillness when noise threatened to overwhelm him. He would set down burdens rather than carrying them constantly. He would allow his mind to rest rather than churning endlessly. He would accept change rather than resisting it. He would trust patterns larger than his understanding. Not perfectly, he was human, and humans were fallible, prone to forgetting, to falling back into old patterns, to losing sight of truth in the midst of challenge. But he would try, and when he forgot, he would remember again, and that cycle of forgetting and remembering was itself part of being human, was part of the pattern Zeus and Hera had spoken of, was nothing to be ashamed of or frustrated by, but simply to be accepted as the natural rhythm of mortal existence. The morning continued its gentle progression toward noon, and Lysander felt sleep beginning to gather at the edges of his awareness, not the troubled sleep that had characterized his nights for months, filled with anxiety dreams and restless waking, but the clean, simple sleep of a body that was truly tired and a mind that was truly at peace. He shifted slightly, making himself more comfortable against the tree, and allowed his eyes to close more fully, allowed consciousness to begin its drift toward dreams, toward the rest that his system clearly needed after the extraordinary journey he had undertaken. As he slipped toward sleep, he felt the presence of Olympus still with him, not as a place left behind but as a reality integrated, as a truth that would remain regardless of distance or time. The gods were there, above the clouds, maintaining their eternal watch, offering their quiet blessing to the world below, available to those who sought them with open hearts and humble intentions. And he was here, lying upon the grass beneath an olive tree, blessed and transformed, carrying stillness like a treasure, carrying peace like a flame that could not be extinguished, carrying the memory of a night spent among gods who had taught him that the greatest wisdom was often the simplest, that the most profound gift was learning how to rest. His breathing deepened, slowed, fell into the rhythm of approaching sleep. The sounds of the world around him, bird song and breeze through leaves, distant sheep bells, and even more distant human voices, became soft accompaniment to his rest, present but not demanding attention, simply there as part of the texture of existence. And as sleep claimed him fully, Lysander smiled, his face peaceful in repose, his body completely relaxed, his mind quiet and clear, resting in the knowledge that he had been changed, that he had received gift beyond measure, that he would carry forward what he had been given and that it would serve him in all the days and years ahead. Above, the sun continued its arc across the sky, warming the land, blessing the world with light and life. Mount Olympus stood eternal, keeping its secrets, offering its wisdom to those who sought it. And beneath an olive tree on a hillside overlooking the sea, a traveler slept the sleep of the blessed, his heart at rest, his spirit renewed, his entire being settled into peace that would endure regardless of what challenges the future might bring. The world turned, the day unfolded, and Lysander dreamed, not of problems or anxieties, not of past regrets or future fears, but of gentle things, of beauty and peace, of gods who smiled and offered blessing, of flames that burned eternal and moons that illuminated gently and minds that could rest and hearts that could open and lives that could be lived with stillness at their center. He slept, and his sleep was healing, was restoration, was the final integration of everything he had received, allowing it to sink into the deepest parts of his being where it would remain always, accessible and real, a foundation upon which everything else could rest. The breeze stirred the olive leaves above him, creating patterns of light and shadow that played across his peaceful face. Birds continued their songs. The earth supported him with patient solidity. And somewhere, in a realm above the clouds, gods who had offered blessing watched over him still, ensuring his rest was complete, his healing thorough, his transformation lasting. Sleep well, weary traveler. Your journey has brought you home, not to a place, but to yourself. The stillness you found on Olympus was always within you, waiting to be remembered. And now, having remembered, you carry it forward into all your days. The gods watch over you. the peace remains. And you are blessed, now and always, with the gift of knowing how to rest, how to be still, how to access the quiet that dwells at the heart of all things. Sleep now. Dream peacefully. And wake, when the time comes, renewed and ready, carrying Olympus in your heart. All is well. All is peace. All is as it should be.